We have Toby Grotz coming up, so let me, this is going to be a little bit of a longer introduction right now, because Toby's had a very diverse background, a very unique background, and I'd like to do diligence on the introduction to him. So, and I'd just like to say a word about Toby and Kate. His wife is here with him. I've had the pleasure of spending some time with them last year, and two people, I'd say two, even though you're hearing Toby talk, very dedicated to the pursuit, a long-time pursuit of moving this field forward, and also doing it in a more holistic way as well. So I think you're both wonderful examples of that, and I just want to acknowledge you. So Toby has had 40 years of experience looking at these different technologies. He has a bachelor's degree in science and in electrical engineering, experience in power systems, design in coal, natural gas, nuclear power plants. He's been effectively managing projects in energy and utility industry, researching alternative energy systems. He's a blogger. He organized, chaired various conferences, and held presidential positions in new energy. So he's been doing this for a long time. In 1984, he started the Tesla Centennial Symposium. So he's also traveled worldwide, interviewing new energy researchers and inventors, and conducted tests on new energy systems at the request of inventors or also investors. So he's been doing this for a long time, has seen much in this arena. In 1997, he began a relationship with Tawari, who some of you may have heard of. How many of you have heard of Tawari? Okay, so quite a few. He was the one that put www.tawari.org online in order to present the theories and experiments conducted by Mr. Tawari to a worldwide audience. Mr. Groats has made the connection between Tesla's use of Sanskrit to describe the physical universe and the work of Tawari. He believes that he fulfilled the prophecy of Tesla. Ere many generations pass, mankind will succeed in attaching his machinery to the very wheelworks of nature. My pleasure to introduce you this morning, Toby.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. I was going through some letters that I found just last week that my mother had saved, and in those letters was an envelope from 1924. My grandfather had been in Amsterdam, and I had not known it till last week, so my family's back. And thank you for being here today. My talk today is going to be about Bruce dePalma, who I visited in December of 1993. And just recently have really fully begun to appreciate the depth of his experience and his knowledge, because he kind of started and gave the foundation for what we're doing today. He inspired a lot of inventors, and his research, I think, is behind what we need to understand if we're really going to bring free energy to fruition. I'll start with a quote of dePalma's, and that kind of feeds into some of the philosophical and political discussion we've had here in the last 2 days. In a world which is past beyond the gentlemanly dialogues and colloquia of the 19th and early 20th century, is it not clear to be seen in the rising waters, earthquakes, fires, and plagues upon mankind, God's answer to the acolytes and servitors of greed and ego? And that quote comes from Tom Vallone's his review of Tom Vallone's review of his work in Tom Vallone's Homopolar handbook. Bruce dePalma died in 1997. He was the son of a noted orthopedic surgeon, Anthony dePalma, and he's the elder brother of Brian dePalma, the famous film director. And you'll see that the name dePalma is split here between Bruce's name and Brian's. Bruce told me that he was the black sheep of the family, and in order to distinguish himself from his famous brother, he took out the space between the D and the Palma. The dePalma's came from Campania in the province of Naples. So he graduated as an electrical engineer from MIT in 1958, and that is quite an achievement to get through an engineering school. It's the top engineering school in the country, if not Georgia Tech or Stanford. They're all in the same class. But he got through MIT in 1958, and he lectured undergrad electrical engineering classes. He attended graduate school and in engineering and physics, and he also was at Harvard University for some time. But he left Harvard because it was just too boring. He was a lecturer in photographic sciences in the laboratory of Harold Edgerton, and he directed 3D photographic research for Dr. Edward Land of Polaroid Corporation. That's important because he was able to use some of that very high-speed equipment that Dr. Edgerton had invented for high-speed photography. He commenced his work in phrenology through his studies of the gyroscope and the nature of motion. He invented the N machine, a free electrical generator, in 1977 and 78 timeframe. So the origin of the N machine, he wanted answers to the problems of society. And it was the 60s. It was a time of revolution and protest, and cities were burning, and political assassinations were happening. The hippies took over Berkeley, Woodstock, Timothy Leary, all of that kind of coalesced into where are we going as a society. And Bruce was heavily involved in thinking about how can he make the world a better place. He wanted answers to the problems of society. And he thought that the real problem was that people don't get around. They don't have a way to talk to each other. If they had cheaper energy for transportation and they could mix and talk, they could communicate more. And you know, as you travel around, and I think that Europeans have more of an advantage to travel along multiple different types of people than we do in the United States. You find that everybody wants the same thing. They want to go home, they want to raise their kids, raise their family. Wherever you go in the world, everybody wants the same thing. And Bruce thought that if it was easier to travel, if energy was cheap, we'd be able to intermingle and understand each other better. So he moved from Boston to MIT in 1970 and began meditating on what is space. If you want to push against something other than the ground, you have to learn about space. It began by studies of inertia. And you're familiar with the Dremel tools or any type of a high-speed tool. You know, when you move it along the axis, it has a different feeling than if you try to move it horizontal. And to him, all the equations of motion that he had taken at MIT just didn't fit the answers as to why this was. What was this force that he felt when he moved the high-speed tool around? So the first experiments that he started doing outside the realm of standard physics were spinning and non-spinning balls. He took 1-inch diameter pinball machine balls, steel balls, spinning at 18,000 to 27,000 RPM, and he thrust them up at an angle. He found that the spinning balls went higher and they fell faster. And that's a result of him being associated with the person that was responsible for developing high-speed photography at MIT, Dr. Edgerton. He was able to use that equipment to show that the spinning balls went higher and fell faster. So there was a difference in the acceleration of gravity and related to an object spinning that had a spin in this space. So we wanted to know, what is it about space that causes the difference in that spinning rate or that ability to go further and fall? So that was published actually in the proceedings of the first International Symposium on Non-Conventional Energy Technology, 1981. University of Toronto. And I'd like to say that Peter Lindemann and Gene Manning preceded me into this field. I was a latecomer. They were in it much sooner than I was, and were studying all of these inventors and visiting them and trying to get more information about this esoteric, strange science that was just becoming known in the 50s and 60s. One of the things that I'd like to...
These experiments were run way before 1981 also.
Yeah. Yeah, that was published, as Peter points out. That's when it was first published. in the symposium. And what I want to say was that these symposia that we had, we used to have proceedings from the symposium. And I'd like to add this kind of to what John was saying about the kind of information that we need to gather. These symposiums are great. They're being broadcast around the world, and they will be recorded on YouTube's. But where do you go to get the paper copy of the list of the footnotes for the paper so that you can go look them up? We really need to have a library, an online library of all the papers that all these inventors have published so that we can access them, because this International Symposium on Non-Conventional Energy in the University of Toronto, you can't get that. I happen to have a copy, but there were only 200 copies probably printed. And there's a wealth of information in that paper. That entire proceeding should be scanned to PDF and OCR'd so that you can do a search on that and then have a database with probably thousands of papers, including all of dePalma's papers, that you could go and search by keyword and then be able to look up the concepts that we need to have inventors to be able to look at to help them with their work. This is a particular experiment that should be done in high school physics classes, let alone university physics classes. So very simple.
Also, vacuum. That's test. Does that happen also in vacuum?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, being an MIT person, he took every aspect into account. Yeah. So then he got interested in the effect of gyroscopes on space. How does space affect the spinning gyroscope? And he found that rotating objects falling are accelerated at a rate greater than g, i.e. 9.8 meters per second squared. And counter-rotating gyroscopes showed a weight loss. So now we're talking about anti-gravity effects. This is a picture that Gene Manning just sent me of a spinning gyroscope device, the force machine. And thank you, Peter. I'm still just learning the depth and wisdom of Bruce dePalma. I believe this was at a 1990 conference of Borderland Sciences. That machine itself just cost $50,000 in 1960s money to create that. That's a picture of the machine itself. As you can see, this is the flywheel, two flywheels, so they can be spun together counterclockwise or clockwise, and then this whole cage could be made to rotate. So this particular cylinder here could rotate as well as have the rotating gyroscopes within it. Now we get into something even stranger, is that it seems that a rotating object will affect time. And he did experiments with the properties of the inertial field in the presence of rotating objects to show that the frequency of vibration of a tuning fork, basically, simple tuning fork, in an Accutron watch shows differences in time between it and a watch removed from the rotating object. After 1,000 seconds, the Accutron watch was 0.8 of a second slower when placed over the axis of a flywheel. And that's the particular setup that he used. And you can see that he glued the Accutron watch to a regular 60-cycle clock, and you could see that there was a difference in the time between the two. So that inertial rotation of space somehow affects time, and it affects the frequency of vibration of the tuning fork. That's an experiment I suggested could be repeated by high school physics classes as well, especially in the day and age when you can get oscillating tuning fork oscillators for pennies a piece on DigiKey. You can order them and set them up as circuits to test this theory. So that's the type of experimental work we should be recreating in this field to be able to present the data to physicists and to investors to show them that, yes, there is something different going on that you can't explain, and we need to be able to proceed to fund this, to proceed and be able to make these things happen. We talked about inertia with Bruce dePalma's studies of inertia, and Tesla said there is no such thing as inertia of, there is such a thing as inertia of human opinion resisting revolutionary ideas. And I found that in the book by Mark Cypher, Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla. It's that thick. It's the best book ever written on Tesla. I would highly recommend that you get that book and read it if you want to know about Tesla, because much of what you find on the internet about Tesla is not correct. And this is, to me, an authoritative source. Mark spent years writing this book. He had first had a master's degree thesis, and he turned it into a book over a period of about 20 years. Another thing I'd like to point out is there was a film I just found called The Zenith Factor. It was made in 1984 by Sky Fabian, and it is a documentary that was made at the 1984 Tesla Centennial Symposium. And you can find that at documentaryaddict.com/films/Tesla, The Zenith Factor. And a lot of that documentary has Mark Seifert talking about the work of Tesla. That documentary also has interviews with Elizabeth Rauscher, Bill Bice, and Tom Bearden that you'll find very interesting. And these are all people that preceded us. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and they're gone now. So we've got to preserve that history. And my attempt to preserve that history was to take a video that I made in 1993 with a Hi8 video camera, Sony Hi8 video camera, of Bruce dePalma in New Zealand. And I'll play a section of that for you just in a minute. That was an exercise in technology, getting a Hi8 video files converted to an MP3-4. I felt like a very old guy trying to do that. Also on the website, under the section they made for my part of this conference, I've uploaded and put together about 250 pages of Bruce dePalma's research and work in a PDF document that you can download right here, the dePalma papers. And it's also optical OCR, so you can search on keywords. And also you can watch the full hour interview with Bruce dePalma. The actual link for those who may have trouble finding it is globalbem.com/myname-groats-2. So that's us in 1993, December of 1993 in New Zealand. And I want to give credit to Andrew Mont, who was a dedicated, hardworking personal secretary for Bruce, and Paul Clark, who was responsible for logistics and driving me around while I was there. And then, of course, you see myself and Bruce. Now, can we play the interview? I may need some tech support here. End machine, how did that terminology or that term come about? What does it stand for?
Well, n means the nth degree. Because when it first came into my head that what I should call this thing, I guess I can say this now. When something happens like this, like somebody coming up with a simple way of extracting energy from space, which will transform society, or at least spark the transformation of society from a consumptive to an outgoing, expanding situation, is a very special time. It's like everything contracts down to a point and then expands out from a point. Chardin, in his work about the future history of man, talks about this point. I believe there's a myth to free energy in that in any intelligent society, in any planet in the universe, when it reaches the point in its intellectual development where it can conceive that this is a possible principle, the same people, the same souls are manifest to do the same job. So you have to say to yourself, why did I call it the end machine? Because it was so clear in my mind to call it the end machine that I didn't have to think about it. It just came, just like I knew it wouldn't have any drag. I also knew I had to call it the end machine because I knew that there were end things that would come out of this thing, that this would change our way of thinking, our way of living. This would take us into space, which is where I really think the human race is destined to go, and provide the power plant for the spaceship with a non-consuming, or consumptive source of energy.
So he quoted in that clip, Terre de Chardin, the future of man. And Chardin had said the human species is evolving spiritually, progressing from a simple faith to a higher and higher forms of consciousness, including a consciousness of God, and culminating in the ultimate understanding of humankind's place and purpose in the universe. And you'll also notice that Bruce referenced souls incarnating time and time again. Did anybody feel like they've been here before, maybe? Or met some people that they seem like they've met before? Maybe we have all met before. And that's kind of, I wanted to give you a feel for the overall thinking of Bruce. Not only was he a physicist, but he referenced a book that my stepfather, who was a Smulders, who came from Holland, had on his bookshelf. And interestingly enough, I read that book when I was about 14, and here is Bruce dePalma quoting it. So it was quite a revelation when I went back and looked at this film again. Chardin was a Jesuit priest, and my stepfather had been raised by Jesuits. Chardin was a paleontologist, and he talked about the omega point, which Bruce is talking about in his talk. And the omega point is, some people now call it the 0 point, but Chardin came up with this in the 20s or 30s. It's the time when people will all over the world realize that they are one, and they will eventually learn to coexist happily together at some time when our consciousness merges to a higher level. And that's where Bruce wanted us to head. He designed this as a kit for physics classes. The interesting thing about Bruce was he wasn't the inventor that was out there that had decided my invention is not only going to save the world, but I'm going to get rich, and the investors are going to get rich, and everybody's going to get rich. I never got that from Bruce. He was interested in science and probing deeper into the nature of reality through physics. So what happened to the M machine? And I brought this up because as I was doing research for this paper, going through my files, and I've got file cabinets in the garage and in the basement full of papers from the last 40 years, I found a faxed letter from 1995 from the Space Power Corporation in Australia. So if we have friends that are watching this or will see this on the other side of the world, or if you know somebody on the other side of the world, maybe we can find out what happened to Bruce's N machine. Mike Fisher from the Space Power Corporation said that the machine and the drive motor went to an El Russo on Wesley Street in Auckland, New Zealand, and the torque sensor, speed sensor, and power meter were sold to the University of Auckland School of Engineering. And I've tried to run down those addresses and those phone numbers, and of course that's so long ago, it's all changed, nobody answers the phone. But maybe somebody on the other side of the world can find this machine, because I'd like to resurrect it, and we'd like to run some tests on it again. I mean, unless it's gone to the junk pile, which probably it hasn't because it's so heavy, it's probably sitting somewhere in a back room, we could probably run that machine again.
Plans don't exist?
The plans, no, they don't exist. They're kind of handwritten and sketched. And a lot of that may have disappeared by now. So what is the origin of the N machine? Well, in 1832, Michael Faraday performed an experiment which was actually an inverse of a previous experiment from 10 years earlier. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the Faraday disk is known as the first electromagnetic generator. So this is the invention of electricity, Michael Faraday. It's one of the four big things that happened in our evolution. It's also known as the homopolar generator, the uniponal generator, the cyclic generator, and the disk dynamo. And the way this works is a copper disk with a magnet affixed is rotated by a hand crank. And there is a contact up against the edge of the disk and a contact that goes up from this point to the center of the disk. And when you turn this crank, you can measure a voltage between these 2 points. And that's schematically shown here that there is a magnetic field going through the center disk, and a voltage can be seen if you go from the periphery of the disk to the axis of the disk. Now, Barlow's wheel in 1822 was the exact opposite of this, in that Barlow had put a voltage across the periphery of a disk and the axis of a disk and made a motor. So you see how technology evolves one step at a time over many years. And I want to emphasize that many years because I'm going to get to that again and later in the slideshow. Standard generators, as you know, probably know, require that a coil of wire be moved past a magnetic field, two magnets here. And that results in a alternating current waveform, such as we have in our houses today, 50, 60 cycle waveforms. The homopolar generator or a battery is the only way to get a direct steady state voltage and current. So just to go over some of the configurations that you could do with a copper disc and a round magnet, there are three variations of that. You can have a rotating disc magnet and a stationary copper disc, or you can have a rotating copper disc and a rotating disc magnet, or you can have a stationary disc magnet and a rotating disc conductor. And only in two cases do you get, a voltage across the periphery and the axis of the machine. And this particular machine has confounded physics explanations ever since it was invented. This is from the Homopolar Handbook by Tom Vallone, and it was originally published in Magnets Magazine in 1988. The first N machine was developed at the Sunburst community in Santa Barbara, and you'll see this configuration here is the center conducting disk and magnets on either side with voltage across the periphery and the axis of the machine. Sunburst community in California was 4,000 acres of very beautiful farmland and rolling hills that was kind of a commune for the disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda. And Norman Paulson, who was a disciple of Yogananda, invited Bruce to come to the commune. And there was another man there named Yogacharya Bernard Cole, who in 1938, when he was a junior in high school, decided this is nonsense, dropped out of high school and went and studied and lived with Paramahansa Yogananda. Later became an engineer, and so he was the actual hands-on engineer, design build that built this first N machine for and with Bruce dePalma. And I mentioned that connection with Yogananda and dePalma and this technology because it is key to understanding where we're going in terms of evolution of consciousness. If you're interested in the details of the homopolar generator and a lot of good design build ideas and a review of the work, had the history, experimental results, engineering data, and construction details. Tom Vallone published a book called The Homopolar Generator, so if you're interested in to pursue it, that's another book that you could add to your collection. So the N effect, which Bruce described in that video, when the core and the coil are rotated, the magnetic field produced by the coil and the magnetic field of load current have no relative motion, and that is the reason for the absence of torque in opposition to the prime mover's torque when the machine is loaded. So loading is similar to an air conditioning coming on, you see the lights dim, or you're cutting wood with a chainsaw, you get into that wood and the motor slows down, or you drive up a hill and you can feel that engine has to accelerate. What happens with the motor is that there is a back torque created. And in the N machine, there is a back torque created when the load is connected. And Robert Kinchlow, who was a professor emeritus at Stanford University, which is very definitely a reputable reviewer of the work, published his paper in 1986, his results of experiments with the end machine. And what he said was, dePalma may have been right in that there is indeed a situation whereby energy is being obtained from a previously unknown and unexplained source. The data showed a large ratio of generated power to input power increase, and 28 times the incremental power. So experimenters start talking about the overall efficiency of a machine, maybe less than 1, but within that machine there is an incremental efficiency that is greater than 1. So that the machine is up and running, you put the load on it, but there is no increase in load to the drive motor. And I've seen that many times in tests of end machines. So that's just incredible to think that somewhere energy is coming from because there's no increased input to the drive machine. So where's that energy come from? How does the magnetic field rotating in space create that energy? And that's what we're kind of looking for in these free energy machines, is how to extract that energy from space. This particular paper is at rexresearch.com. It's also in the paper that I announced previously that's on the website, but I want to bring up rexresearch.com because that is an age-old, going back many decades, assembly of all sorts of esoteric information relating to free energy machines. So it's rexresearch.com. You know, as they say, back in the day, in the 50s, Fate magazine or Popular Mechanics, there might have been a little article, a little classified ad in the back of the magazine. Tesla coils for plans, send $2 to. Esoteric inventions for $2, send to. And so there was a whole community of pre-internet that went on with postage stamps and mail. That was our internet back then, was postage stamps and mail. And then came fax machines, and boy, that was great. So this, I think, was probably the best, if only, lecture Bruce did at a conference where he brought some of his machines, not all of them, but explained his machines. And that was the Borderland Sciences, which was a magazine that was printed in the 60s and 70s, I guess 70s and 80s, and even in the 90s. Borderland Sciences may have even started in the 50s, I believe, by Riley Crabb.
No, it started in the 40s by Meade Lane.
Meade Lane, that's right, in the 40s. So all that type of information, all those magazines really ought to be scanned and PDF'd and put online somewhere as research material, because you keep running across things that are valid avenues of research that you've never heard of before. We've been in this for so many years now, and you keep finding new stuff, but that new stuff is 40, 50 years old. So I want to do a little sidebar here and talk about Bruce dePalma and John Trump. John Trump was a physics professor at MIT. He was the uncle of the 45th president of whatever it is now we call the United States of America, right? So in 1943, Dr. Trump, as a technical aide in Division 14 of the National Defense Research Committee, reviewed and analyzed the papers of Nikola Tesla when the inventor passed away. The research was completed on behalf of the Alien Property Custodian Office in Washington, D.C. I'd like to point out that Bruce and I, in our university studies, never heard the word Tesla. We both graduated as electrical engineer. I from the University of Connecticut, and Bruce from MIT in Massachusetts, so pretty close together. But how could you not hear the word Tesla if you're getting a degree in electrical engineering? At MIT, Bruce never heard the name Tesla, and I never heard the name Tesla. So, inspired by dePalma, a number of people, once dePalma came up with the end machine, started copying and replicating his work and trying to find out more about what this effect was. And that was Inamata, Kahn and Trombley, the Stell Group, Tuari, Vallone, just some of the few. And I'm going to concentrate right now just on Inamata briefly. But before I do that, I want to say that the Stell Group is an intentional community set up in 1973, and it was based on Lemurian philosophy. So we go from Lemurian philosophy, that probably maybe existed in the Pacific Ocean somewhere, the anti-Atlantis maybe, and we see a connection between esoteria and free energy research everywhere you look. So Shuichi Inamata was a PhD researcher at the Electrotechnical University Laboratory, or Electrotechnical Laboratory in Japan, and I visited him in '93. That would be equivalent to a National Bureau of Standards, and it was a giant research facility with many buildings that took up many square acres of space. They had their top researchers in Japan all housed in this research center. And Inamata's vacuum theory requires the re-examination of Dirac's vacuum theory. The absolute vacuum is considered as a balanced sea of both positive and negative shadow energy. Both positive and negative shadow energy are described by shadow-Dirac equations. He concluded that the sea of shadow charge corresponds to a non-material ether. And that's what he called the shadow energy. He published a book in Japan. It's never been translated. I have an original copy of the manuscript, but it's in Japanese. And with all the equations, Maxwell's equations really needs to be translated into English. That's more that I would add to our library that I'm proposing for free energy researchers. That's his machine, and in 1993, we tested this at the Colorado State University during the 1993 International Symposium on New Energy. And his paper is quite explicit in its test data, and his conclusion was the extraction of electrical output energy is not reflected as a corresponding mechanical load to the driving source. I'd like to point out that I think it was Bruce describes it in the video. If you take a hand drill and you turn it on, it twists. Or when you start a motor that you're holding, you get that twist in a skill saw. If that was a homopolar machine, you wouldn't get any twist, because there's no torque on the applied load. Excuse me. So the ether has been proposed as a substratum from which the universe and all matter is composed. The properties of the ether have been described by brilliant minds of the 1800s and early 1900s, such as Newton, Descartes, Maxwell, Lodge, Einstein, Schrödinger. And Tesla learned from Swami Vivekananda, when Vivekananda lectured in New York City, some Sanskrit terminology which allowed Tesla to describe what he had seen during his visions that allowed him to invent alternating current motor. And Tesla said all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance or tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasha, or luminiferous ether, which is acted upon by the life-giving prana or creative force, calling into existence in never-ending cycles, all things and phenomenon. And I wondered if I could get some water. So that came from man's greatest achievement in 1907. And as has already been mentioned, I think 3 times already, or maybe 4 times at this conference, Tesla's great quote was, "Ere many generations pass, our machinery will be driven by a power obtainable at any point in the universe." So that's the quest, is to find the machine that can do that. Thank you very much, John. So the ether that we're probing is a non-material, continuous, and incompressible fluid devoid of any known properties of mass. This is a conceptual painting of the ether, which I would invite you to find at philosophy.org, the Walter Russell website. Walter Russell was a visionary sculptor and painter, and that was his picture, which we believe is representative of the ether. It's called the wave of creation. So the ether is not like anything that we experience in the physical reality. Ether has no mass, has no density, has no separateness and distinctness, no viscosity, no elasticity, no compressibility. Now, the scientists are finally getting around, and Higgs was the first to suggest, all space is filled with an invisible substance. But they don't want to call it the ether, right? Because they threw that out a long time ago. But now they're saying it's full of something. And they've spent $4.7 billion to build a machine, and they saw some noise on a graph, and they think they discovered a particle, and they call it the Higgs boson. We think that the second law of thermodynamics must be modified to take into account recent discoveries which delineate and quantify the substance and properties of space. Now, several times during this lecture, I've heard what is electricity, during this weekend. And I started pondering more about what is electricity, because every time we went to an investor to get funding for a project, the investors' due diligence committee would drag up some physicist from some university. And in the last case that we had, it was a physicist that had been trained by Richard Feynman. And they would say, well, you can't do that because it doesn't exist. And, where's the energy coming from? And I started thinking, well, can you explain to me where the energy is coming from in the system that you know now? You can't explain that as it is. Because what is electricity? Tesla studied it all his life, and he said that day after day, I asked myself, what is electricity? And I've found no answer. 80 years have gone by since, and I still ask the same question. What is electricity? And that comes from another book that ought to be scanned in OCR and put into our library. It was compiled by John Ratzlaff, who founded the Tesla Book Company, and it's a book called Tesla Said. And I don't know where you get a copy of that book. Maybe you can find them on the internet, but it should be scanned.
That was a big book.
Yeah, thick book, great book. So let's do a little bit of review of what we call current. If we hook up a simple circuit, a light bulb wired to a battery, where's my pointer? There it is, here. The battery continually pumps charge around the circuit, lighting the bulb. We call this the flow of current, and that comes from a book called The Cartoon Guide to Physics. It's available on the internet at archive.org/details, The Cartoon Guide to Physics. And then we have this concept called amperes. We often draw an arrow along the wire leading from the battery's positive terminal to the negative terminal, as if positive charges flowed that way. This is called conventional current, as opposed to real current, which is a flow of negative electrons in the opposite direction. See, that's where they lost me in engineering school. They lost me right there. In most electrical effects, there is no way to distinguish between these two possibilities. Well, guess what? Let's take the situation of a light bulb connected to a generator 186,000 miles away. If I turn on the switch at the generator, a second later, the bulb lights up. So something happens for a second, and then the bulb lights up. Electricity operates at the speed of light, but electrons, the supposed carrier of current and energy, only move 23 micrometers per second. So where does the energy come from that lights the bulb 1 second later? It gets even worse. In the case of alternating current, electrons, first they move one direction, and then they move back the other direction. so they never go anywhere. So electrons never go anywhere, so there is no current. So everything I learned about the basics of electrical engineering was wrong from the first day I walked in the classroom. So there is no such thing as current flow. How does the energy get from the generator or battery to the bulb? What is electricity? And I think that's something we need to study if we're going to make these free energy devices. We really have to go back and look at these fundamental concepts, which Bruce dePalma was doing with his M machine, and find out what is electricity, what is current, what is magnetism. Should we not first understand electricity before we just start throwing parts together? But, you know, we can't help ourselves, inventors. We got to just get up in the middle of the night and throw parts together and turn it on and see what works. What is magnetism? Well, it was the Danish physicist Ørsted discovered that a compass needle was deflected by an electric current, supposedly. Now, I started asking about what was electricity and what was magnetism, and having a dialogue with Hal Puthoff and Dieter Roth, two very well published physicists that publish in Physics Review D, mathematics. It's way over my head. And they both came to the conclusion and supported my supposition, no, we don't know what electricity is. So Dieter said, it's generally accepted by the physics community that an observer moving with the motion of an electric charge will not measure any magnetic field. This makes the existence of the magnetic field ephemeral and capricious, and we should question the whole concept of the magnetic field. So he proposed an experiment wherein we would hook a battery across the conductor and then run the compass back and forth along the conductor. So we decided to see, does the magnetic field exist? And this proposed experiment by Dieter was done in my basement lab with a few dollars worth of parts. And at rest, no applied voltage across the conductor. You can see on the left-hand side, the compass needle is pointing north. And when that conductor is energized with about 3 amps going through it, you can see that there's a magnetic field around the conductor, and that compass aligns with that magnetic field, which was about 2 Gauss. So sliding the compass back and forth, according to the physics of relativity, that compass needle should move, but it does not. So Dieter said the magnetic field around the conductor is not a product of electrons moving through the wire. We may suspect the whole idea of magnetic fields is erroneous, and at their very least, we should redefine what an electric current really is and what electric charge is. Magnetism may be a misconceived electric field phenomenon, and someone was talking about fields earlier today. What is this field phenomenon? I say, Houston, we have a problem. We don't understand electricity or magnetism, and we're trying to build free energy devices. So, along the way, dePalma's experience with torque in the M machine, inventors tried to figure out ways to cancel the back torque, and they've been trying to figure out how to cancel back torque ever since the motor was invented. Lenz's law says when electric current is induced in a conductor, the direction of the current is such that its magnetic effect will oppose the action that gives rise to the current and creates a back torque. Back torque requires more mechanical energy input as a generator delivers power. Because of back torque, efficiencies of generators is always less than 1. So this is a diagram of Lenz's law, basically showing that when a current is induced in a magnetic ring because it's moving in a so-called magnetic field, a torque produced in that opposes the power required to move it. So you've got magnetic fields in this particular diagram that are opposing each other, creating a back torque. And to get further into that, I would suggest that you look up the right-hand rule and the left-hand rule, which was proposed by John Ambrose Fleming, in which he showed that the magnetic field points along the index finger, the direction of force is along the thumb, and the direction of current in the wire is along the middle finger. In order to minimize the effects of Lenz's law, a number of circuit configurations have been proposed, and this goes back to a 1947 Radio Engineer's Handbook. This is basic methods to wind coils to overcome the effects of Lenz's law. And this is important because Sparky Sweet used this in his machine, which had a gain of about 6 million. He was using milliwatts input, running a couple of bifilar coils sandwiched between 4x6 permanent barium ferrite magnets. And he was able to get a huge gain and light 6 100-watt light bulbs at 60 cycles. And he was using bifilar coils. That's another machine that I don't think has ever been replicated. Actually, Donnie Watson replicated it, but that's a whole nother story for another lecture. The efficiency of the generator is governed by mechanical and electrical limitations. The mechanical limitations include the windage and friction of the generator rotor and bearings. The electrical limitations include impedance and resistance within the windings of the generator as well as back torque. Therefore, the problem with standard generators is that their efficiency is limited due to back torque generated as a result of current induced within the generator conductor windings. When a prime mover such as steam, wind, or water is attached to a generator to cause the rotation of the generator's rotor, producing either a direct or alternating current within the generator's conductor, a back torque is produced which counters the rotation caused by the prime mover. So, in order to overcome that, there is a circuit that could be used. And in this case, what we're going to look at is a video of how you do that. What you will see in the video is a conductor here over 2 magnets. And the bottom view, the side view of this particular setup is a conductor connected to a pivot. And then you will see the magnets. This conductor would be similar to a conductor between a rotor and a stator of a generator. So what I'm about to show you is a conductor right here that would be in a generator. So that is the setup. This is a demonstration of back torque reduction. Magnet 1, magnet 2, underneath a current carrying conductor. Imagine this conductor to be in the stator of a rotating electrical machine. These magnets would be fixed to the rotor of that machine and spinning past this conductor. In this demonstration, this conductor is mounted on a swivel bearing. And when the power is turned on, you will see that the conductor will pivot because of the torque exerted by the magnetic field in this conductor interacting with the magnetic fields of these magnets. You see the motion of the conductor as a result of interaction with the magnets. In this case, we're running 3 amps through this conductor. Now, if the magnetic circuit in a machine is modified so as to cancel the torque that you saw exerted and resulting in the pivot, by adding magnets in a certain orientation, you'll see that when this machine is turned on, there will be no pivot of the conductor. We're still running 3 amps through the circuit, but no torque is exerted, causing this to pivot. Once again, we can remove and modify the magnetic circuit. And when current again flows through this conductor, you'll see the conductor pivot. So in effect, what we have here is a modification of a standard generator design. When the magnets are placed in the proper orientation, back torque is canceled. So what happens to the efficiency of a generator where back torque is eliminated? A new generation of highly efficient electrical machines is enabled, which can reduce the use of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide emissions. Generator efficiency then is limited only by the strength of the magnetic fields and the speed of rotation. This is a proposed design for a mechanical engineer that was done in order to take advantage of this effect. In this case, you have a rotor and you have a stator, and this rotor consists of magnets placed in a manner such as to cancel back torque. That's a close-up of the machine. Another close-up showing the magnets on the rotor and the windings in the machine. That machine, the inventor, or the engineer that was proposed to do that design for has passed away, and that design was never actually put into practice. But in order to understand what I just told you, and the left-hand rule and the right-hand rule and torque cancellations, you must go to this particular patent application. Under patents.google.com, when you go there, in the search bar, you type in the search bar here, US 201-500-84467. Take that number down, go to Google Patents, and look at that patent application. And in that patent application, go to pages 3 to 5, and you will see in excruciatingly painful technical detail the left-hand rule and the right-hand rule methods of eliminating back torque. And when you get there, you will see that it is very clear that this can be done. Talking about, did you say 5? Wow. Basically, what I wanted to point out was that the waveforms in a lot of the free energy machines require $1,000 meters. And so unless you've got $1,000 meters or more to measure some of these free energy devices, you're not going to get good results. In this particular case, you can see a machine that is being measured with cheap meters that they picked up at the hardware store, and you can't get good response from that. You need crest factor of 4 at least, and frequency responses of at least 300 kilohertz for a lot of these machines. I wanted to talk about chirality and testing Tesla's hypothesis. Tesla described an experiment that showed the slow rotation of a plasma stream in a globe in a clockwise direction. Tesla states it would be counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. But I said, wait a minute, and these are the bulbs that Tesla was using for his plasma experiments. I said, chirality, I know that climbing vines come out of the ground where I live, and looking from the ground up, they're always clockwise. And so they would be the same in the southern hemisphere, otherwise there would be no climbing vines at the equator. So my suggestion is that we test the proposition of Tesla, who said that the plasma stream would be otherwise south of the equator, and get somebody to run a test south of the equator and see if that's true. So my proposed experiment is to perform Tesla's experiment with rotating plasma stream in the southern hemisphere and repeat it in the northern hemisphere. What can we discover without an $8 billion Large Hadron Superconductor Supercollider? I think we can probe the basics of physics just with a few dollars worth of hardware, and we can find out new things. Why don't we have over-unity systems? Well, let's look at this. In 1877, W.W. Gary in Pennsylvania invented a machine, and the people that examined it for Harper's New Monthly Magazine, 1879, said it was a simple contrivance which furnishes its own power and run until worn out by the force of friction. So maybe we have some watchmakers or instrument makers who could recreate Gary's invention, and we're maybe reinventing the wheel, because perhaps free energy happened in 1879 already. Of course, the Keeley Motor Company was in 1872, and I suggest you go to dePalma's website at svpril.com and examine the work of Keeley, because he had a free energy motor in the 1870s, apparently. I want to talk real quickly about Jevons paradox, why we don't have free energy right now. Jevons was a writer in England watching the Industrial Revolution happen in 1866, wrote a paper called The Coal Question. And this is called Jevons paradox. Basically, the increased efficiency always leads to increased resource depletion and population growth. Right? So ever since we started burning fossil fuels, the population went like this. And that's with energy that costs a lot of money. So I come from a place in the United States, upper Midwest, in Wisconsin. We border the upper peninsula of Michigan. Recently went on a camping trip there, and I observed uncut, pristine forest, original primal forest, never been cut, millions of years old. I could walk for miles with no underbrush, and it was so thick that the sunlight rarely got through the canopy. They started logging the Upper Peninsula tens of thousands of square miles, and in 10 years it looked like that. So now what's happening to the rainforest with energy that costs a lot of money? It's turning into a desert. What will happen to the rainforest if energy is free? If chainsaws and bulldozers don't need fuel? How many years will it take to cut it all? The next big thing. It won't be a widget from Apple, a technology stock, a music or movie star, smartphone, flat screen TV. It will be the equivalent of fire, the wheel, electricity, or nuclear energy. These four innovations change the course of history and have influenced the evolution of human consciousness on a planet we call Earth. This technology eliminates the need to burn fuel. This technology is the long sought for free energy machine described by Nikola Tesla when he said, as we've said before, ere many generations pass, mankind will attach its machinery to the very will works of nature. You can't push a rope, you can't force a paradigm shift. I don't think you can make it happen with willpower and money. When we're ready for it, we'll get it. Consider the impossible invention, 1903, Wright brothers' first flight, the timeline all the way through up until we landed on the moon 63 years later. By the way, 4 years after first flight, the Wright brothers were still looking for funding. Astounding. So if we applied that time frame to the free energy that we're talking about with Nui Foundation, I hate to throw water on the parade here, but let me suggest that if 1979, when Bruce invented the N machine, the equivalent would be by 2042, maybe we'll have free energy. Because we don't understand what electricity and magnetism is, how can we build a free energy machine? So, like I said, you can't force an innovation like control of fire or the use of the wheel or electricity. You have to wait for it. You have to be patient. For everything, there is a season and a time to every purpose. under the heaven, Ecclesiastes. I think that's appropriate. Beware of your current understanding of physics. Many people said what couldn't be done. For instance, Lee DeForest, American radio pioneer and inventor of the triode vacuum tube, said that technically feasible, perhaps it'll never happen. He was talking about television. But I do think that we can get power generation from Ayurvedic theory of 5 elements, the 5th element being space. I think that we've succeeded in getting energy from the first 4 elements, and the ether space is where we will get the energy for the free energy machines. I propose that we should do a open source hardware design, set up a file structure on a server somewhere, and invite people to be part of these projects, that GlobalBEM, the free energy research groups, can determine how this is all administrated. And I say that to the physicist, no pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars or sailed an uncharted land or opened a new doorway for the human spirit. That came from Helen Keller. Over Unity, free energy systems will be built, and to the physicist I say, you'll just have to deal with it. So you can learn more about it in Gene Manning's and Susan Manowich's book, Hidden Energy. It's for sale here at the conference, or maybe it's sold out by now. But I think that we're going to get there eventually. We don't know when. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you.